Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I am excited to introduce our guest this evening. When Stephen Greenblatt last appeared at the library, he told us the story of a curious man whose discovery of an ancient manuscript filled with subversive ideas would spur the imaginations of some of the great creators of the Renaissance. The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, would go on to win both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. Greenblatt's other books include the New York Times bestselling Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare, Hamlet in Purgatory, and Learning to Curse, Essays in Early Modern Culture. A two-time Guggenheim Fellow and former president of the Modern Language Association, Greenblatt is Cogan University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. His new book, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, delves into the boundless creation story of the founding parents of all humanity. Biographer and historian A.N. Wilson writes, Mr. Greenblatt's wonderfully rich, detailed, humorous, and imaginative survey reveals the sheer wealth of the biblical mythology and how it continues to raise questions that Darwinism doesn't answer. Tonight, he joins us to take us back to the garden and beyond. Please welcome Stephen Greenblatt.
Thank you, Andy. It's wonderful to be back here. I'm delighted to see you all. I'm going to speak briefly tonight about the book I've written on Adam and Eve, an attempt to explain why the story had the remarkable life in our culture that it possessed, and specifically why certain creative geniuses invested themselves body and soul in the story in the attempt to bring the first humans to life. The Hebrew story of our origins, probably inscribed in the form that we know it now in the 6th century before the Common Era, but almost certainly much older than that, in dating from somewhere early in the first millennium, is one of the most significant imaginative creations in recorded history. Let's see if I get this to work. Oops, I'm pushing the wrong thing. There we go, yeah. This is from a very early medieval door that is in Germany. The story was invented by one or more ancient storytellers whose identity is forever unknown to us, but Adam and Eve ceased to be inventions. On the contrary, they came for virtually everyone, from simple peasants to towering intellectuals. They became the couple who stood at the inception of all human life, and whose actions, which were attested, of course, by Holy Scripture, had a decisive and, in fact, fatal impact on the nature and history and ultimate destiny of humankind. They were our founders. For better or worse, they made us what we are. The three great monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all committed themselves to this narrative that traced the origin of our species to this single named pair. The commitment was by no means immediate and complete. The earliest commentators on Genesis speak of the first humans in a variety of ways, sometimes as if they once actually existed, but very often instead as allegorical representations, figures in a parable, mystical symbols, shadowy emblems of human nature. It was only through a very long process that Adam and Eve came to be understood not simply as our symbolic antecedents, but also as our literal origins. Every detail of the biblical account was poured over with fascination, with anxiety, and with interpretive cunning. Through the combined imaginative labor of innumerable people of every social rank and every level of skill, our progenitors gradually, slowly acquired a startling and uncanny solidity, the solidity of reality itself. So let's say these figures from the Hildesheim doors, of course we see the scene, we can recognize it. The serpent looks more like I suppose like a cock than a rooster than a dragon, but it's meant to look something like that. In between Eve's legs. Adam, you can see, is pointing under his arm to who's responsible, and Eve is pointing down to who's responsible. The figures don't somehow immediately strike us as being exactly like us, but here's from the 18th century, Ercole Lelli's figures made out of wax over human bones that are in the great collection, wax collection of anatomical figures in Bologna, and these are Adam and Eve. They become real, as it were. Genesis chapters 2 and 3, that's to say the part of Genesis that is the story of the naked man and the naked woman and the talking snake in the magical, strange garden with its trees. Genesis came to be understood as a narrative of a primordial and quintessential historical event. Gradually, the Bible's origin story accumulated an enormous apparatus of support. Teachers endlessly repeated it. Institutions rewarded believers and punished skeptics. Artists vividly represented it. Intellectuals teased out its nuances and offered competing interpretations of all of its puzzles. The interpretations were encoded in doctrines, and those doctrines had a direct impact upon the lives of millions of people. The risk in focusing on the vast collective work is like a kind of coral reef with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of contributions that across many centuries and cultures fashioned Adam and Eve. The risk in doing that is not only that it would be endless work and way above my pay grade, but also that we lose a sense of the titanic bursts of energy that on occasion propelled the story violently forward and sometimes in a direction that it wasn't going before. Perhaps the greatest of these bursts of energy came from Augustine of Hippo, the great 5th century bishop, who devoted to the primal couple an obsessive, lifelong attention. Like many of the more sophisticated Jewish and Christian thinkers, Augustine, who was immensely sophisticated, could have adopted the strategy of allegorizing the story's most awkward or conceptually embarrassing moments. He knew that the story was the object of jokes by pagan skeptics and also by skeptics within the Christian faith itself. It was an embarrassing story to many, but Augustine refused to take that way out. For him, and through him, for all of Orthodox Christianity that followed in the West, the incarnation of the Savior, the incarnation of Jesus, was bound up inseparably and literally with the original human transgression. It was critically important for this reason, Augustine felt, to determine the precise nature of Adam and Eve. I fell in Adam, said St. Ambrose, Augustine's spiritual mentor. I fell in Adam was I expelled from paradise, in Adam I died. And Christ does not recall me unless he has found me in Adam. But just what did it mean to be in Adam? For Augustine, it meant above all to be subject to what he called the law of the members. He took the term from St. Paul. Above all that, there's a technical term he used, concupiscence, that marked human sexuality after the fall and transmitted to all of their descendants the guilt, the culpability of the first humans, and the shame that we all necessarily feel in our nakedness. Concupiscence is the mechanism by which sin was passed along from the first couple all the way to us. Sinfulness for St. Augustine was a sexually transmitted disease of the soul. Before the fall, of course, it was altogether different, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Since the Gentiles who embraced Christianity were the heirs to centuries of Greek and Roman art, and since they regarded the unfallen Adam and Eve as perfectly beautiful, we might have expected them to continue to produce paintings and sculptures of splendid bodies, naked and unashamed. Of course, the Jews, and much later the Muslims, couldn't do that because there were prohibitions in Judaism and Islam against producing iconic images. But Christians had no such prohibitions, and we might have expected that the Christians precisely would embrace the opportunity to depict beautiful bodies, as the pagans had done. But that's not what the early Christians produced. In Paradise, the human body was like ours, but not quite. It was more beautiful, but it also lacked the experience of ardor, of being stretched taut, and was never excited in arousal, sexual arousal. This vision of the way it was in the beginning left the unfallen humans with physical forms that proved difficult to represent, except in what we might call dream states. So Adam, in medieval representations, typically lies asleep while God pulls the form of Eve from his side. Both are naked, and they don't reach out to cover themselves. So we're at a moment in which the body doesn't display an anticipatory awareness of the disgrace that's to come, but the figures tend to be either unconscious or only partially formed. My personal favorite is this one from a 15th century illuminated manuscript in the Vatican Library. Naked Adam, as you can see, lies asleep on a kind of rock couch. He is actually covering himself, but presumably just accidentally, while robed God stands behind him, delicately holding, as you can see in his left hand, a rib. Can you see it? There it is. A rib on whose top sits Eve's head. He's not yet formed the rest of her body so that she looks rather like a stick puppet, but with his right hand, God is already giving the bare rib his blessing. The figures in creation scenes like this are in effect a gesture by medieval artists toward the unashamed nakedness of Adam and Eve in paradise. But the bodies of the first man and the first woman are only notionally there. The artists who crafted such images were not ignorant of the pagan past. They could still have seen around them many remnants of classical nudes in all of their shameless beauty. They could, if they wished, have taken these nudes as models for the original humans in their perfection and in their unfallen innocence. But for the most part, they chose to fashion something else, something that marked a threshold that had been crossed, the threshold of faith. The earliest Christian art already signaled its conceptual distance from pagan culture with its insistent celebration of nudity, its gods and heroes comfortable in their well-toned, beautifully proportioned bodies. Thus, the earliest image that I've been able to find of Adam and Eve, and to see it for myself, comes from the 3rd century, so very early, the 3rd century of the Common Era, where you can go now today into the torchlit darkness of the Catacomb of Saints Pietro and Marcellino in Rome. And here, the Christian faithful looked up at various images of salvation, including such figures as Noah, who looks like a jack-in-the-box and what is meant to be his ark, or Daniel, who's standing in the lion's den. And among these images, the images that show people being saved as appropriate, I suppose, for such a setting, along these images is a wall painting of the naked Adam and Eve standing on either side of a tree. Nothing could be further from Apollo or Venus than this abject couple. Their heads lowered and their arms hunched forward, the figures are anxiously covering their genitals. They are responsible, and they know it, for the reason that we're down below the ground in the first place, in the dark and dank tufa, hollowed out by workmen in order to bury bodies in those slots. One of the workmen, in fact, is actually depicted, one of the most remarkable images down there in this particular catacomb is, I find fascinating, actually quite realistic representation of one of the workmen who's got a lantern and that he's holding on a chain, and he's also got the tools with which he's digging into the tufa to bury these bodies underground. The bodies that die because of what Adam and Eve did. By the next century, after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine the Great, these images are from before the conversion of the Roman Emperor to Christianity, so these are very, very early Christian images. But after the conversion, Christianity had come out into the sunlight of the Roman world, but the faithful remained committed to the imagery of shame that they had created in the underground burial chambers. I'll go back, if I can, to that image. Around the year 359 of the Common Era, a powerful Roman senator, a man named Junius Bassus, died, and he was buried in a magnificent marble sarcophagus. So, as befitted someone who was recently converted, newly baptized, as the inscription declared, his sarcophagus was elaborately carved with images from the Old and New Testament. And the naked Adam and Eve were there, but not to represent the paradisal bliss to which the wealthy senator, I'm sure, hoped to ascend. Rather, they represent, in the words of St. Paul, the body of this death from which the deceased hoped to be delivered. By the fatal tree around which the serpent is coiled, you can just barely, you can see the remains of the serpent's broken off here. This couple looks down and away from one another. This is not a happy marriage. Disgraced, ashamed, and now painfully alone, even when they're in each other's company, they press fig leaves to their genitals. There's no escape from shame, just as there's no escape from death. So, though the rule of shame, which is so prominent in this medieval art, continued into the later Middle Ages, it continued for centuries. You represented the body as an object, the naked body, as something ashamed. Some artists gradually began to explore new and surprising ways of giving more flesh, as it were, to Adam and Eve, even under the sign of its disgrace. And the most spectacular of these explorations, at least for me, the most spectacular one, is found in the town of Autun in eastern France. There, around the year 1130, on a lintel above the porch of the church of Saint-Lazare, a stonemason named Gislebertus carved this life-size image of Eve. Gislebertus's Eve bears the traditional marks of shame. Her genitals are hidden discreetly by the sculpted trunk and leaves of a small tree, and though she's stretched out on the ground, she's kneeling as if in penance. She rests her head on her right hand in a gesture that might represent sadness or remorse. And yet, here the conventional imagery of the abject body, which is typical, as I say, of medieval representations, here it begins to vanish. Because I think you will agree with me that this Eve has a startling erotic allure. She's beautiful in a way that we can easily grasp. Her long hair falls loose over her shoulders, and her upper torso is turned outward toward us, showing her beautiful breasts. Her slender arm reaches back along her body, while her hand, I don't know if you can see it, yes, grasps a fruit here from a tree behind her. A tree in which, though this is harder to see, a snake's body appears to be twisted. And the strange effect, at least to me, is that her hand seems to be operating on its own, without her conscious will. Gislebertus, in other words, has created, or has extrapolated perhaps from the long Christian tradition, two features that confer a peculiarly intense reality effect on his figure. First of all, there's the possibility of forming a relationship on the part of Eve with those who look upon her. This Eve is in some relationship to us looking at her. And second, there's the possibility of something hidden inside her, something unknown even to her. Both of the features, I think, are ambiguous, and maybe I'm exaggerating them as you see it for yourself. But the more one looks, I think, the more this Eve at once tantalizes and resists very clear resolution. She's evidently in the act of plucking the fruit, but she's not yet carried it to her mouth. And indeed, as she leans her head on her hands and looks on musingly, she seems dreamily far away from that moment. Perhaps she's still innocent. And since in that case she would not yet feel shame, the leaves that shield her private parts would not be a sign of her awakened sexuality. Insofar as we're aroused, it's a sign of our fallenness. At the same time, her kneeling and her melancholy gaze still suggests that maybe she is fallen. She may be mourning lost innocence. Or perhaps her turning toward us is a kind of provocation. So I ask you, what is it? Is she innocent or is she guilty? Is she a siren or is she a penitent? Is she an emblem of everything that we're meant to leave behind when we go through that portal and enter the church? Or is she a model for the kind of penitence that is appropriate for the sacred space? I think it's impossible to say. Gislebertus was able to use the conventions, the peculiar conventions of medieval art to create an Eve who's at once aware and unaware of sinfulness, floating in a dream state of innocence and kneeling in abjection. The sacrifice that the sculptor made in order to produce this effect was of an entirely believable human body, as the Greeks and Romans, for example, so magnificently depicted it. This is not, the body doesn't move like this, at least unless you've done a tremendous amount of yoga and Pilates. That classical heritage was a distant past, and Gislebertus, if he recognized it at all, would have regarded it as a small price to pay for the effect that he so brilliantly achieved here. But in the centuries that followed, the price that Gislebertus paid, the price of a convincing human body, began to loom larger and larger until it came to seem unacceptable. And even the briefest account of the momentous shift that I'm describing would certainly have to include the fresco that many of you will think of, or have perhaps seen, that's in the Church of the Carmelite Nuns in Florence. And that shows the grief-stricken Adam and Eve at the moment of their expulsion through the gates of paradise. When I first saw these figures in the 1960s, hard to believe that long ago, they were modestly, if scantily, dressed in fig leaves. Modesty aside, their covering made sense since, as we read in Genesis, Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves together in the wake of their fall in response to their newfound experience of shame. And God, for his part, actually, we're told, dressed them in skins before driving them out of paradise. So from a strictly biblical point of view, the fig leaf figures in the fresco here were, if anything, a bit underdressed. But a thorough cleaning of the fresco in the 1980s removed the fig leaves. They turned out to have been a much later addition after the artist had created those figures, and disclosed that Masaccio's Adam and Eve were completely naked. Her head tilted back, her eyes closed, her mouth open in a soundless wail. Eve attempts to cover her genitals with one hand and her breasts with the other. Her sense of shame bears no relation to the scene in which she finds herself. That is to say, it's not a social emotion. She's not trying to preserve her dignity. It's a primordial sense of what she has to do in the face of unendurable exposure. Adam's response is different. His head bent down, he covers his face with his hands in a paroxysm of misery. And unlike Eve, in the painting the fresco that Masaccio originally did before it was discreetly covered over, as you can see, his genitals are startlingly visible. Masaccio's unforgettable figures depend on an illusion of actuality that's heightened by such things as the shadows that they're casting. Can you see that? And by the effect of movement. Adam's right foot still touches the threshold of paradise, as you can see, but not for long. They're in the world now. And unlike the angel, who possesses wings and a beautiful garment and a sword and is on a kind of magic carpet up there, the humans are utterly unprepared. The prime source of their misery is no doubt the shame and guilt that they feel as a result of having committed their transgression. But if you look at the barren soil that they're standing on, you can't see it entirely clearly, but there are little stones down there too, you can realize that they're entering a harsh environment, and they have nothing whatever to shield or protect them. Adam's genitals, in this case, are which are so central, weirdly central to the composition, from this perspective is not a sign of his virility, than a sign of his being unprotected. his being what Shakespeare calls unaccommodated man in a very hard world. The other painting that marks, for me at least, what the Renaissance did with the insistence that comes from St. Augustine that the Adam and Eve figures are real, are literal, is found on the outer panels of the Flemish master Jan van Eyck's celebrated Ghent altarpiece. It comes from 1432. The figures here are not dramatic in a way that Masaccio's that I just showed you are, but the panels invite you to look very, very carefully at these remarkable representations of human nakedness. Adam's expression is sober. His hands are reddened, if you look carefully, probably from labor. He's a laborer. Eve holds a very weird-looking fruit in one hand, probably some kind of citrus, I'm not sure. Her belly, the womb from which we're all descended, is strikingly prominent. Everything in the minutest detail seems to be open to view. No artist, including Michelangelo, who painted his famous fresco of the creation of Adam on the Sistine ceiling about 80 years later, has ever matched, let alone exceeded, the astonishing realism of Van Eyck's Adam and Eve. Can you see that Adam's foot turns outward so that his toes seem to be projecting out of the niche and toward the viewer? It's as if he's come alive and was stepping out of the niche toward us. But in the 15th century, when this altarpiece was painted, Adam could only have had this magical effect on viewers who happened to be in Ghent and went to St. Bavo's Cathedral and saw the altarpiece in its open state. And the same need to be present was true if you wanted to see Masaccio's Adam and Eve in the Carmine in Florence, or Michelangelo's Adam on the Sistine ceiling, or the hundreds and hundreds of other Renaissance paintings that participated in the project of conferring bodies on the first humans. All of these works, in that sense, are site-specific. So everything changed in the year 1504. That was the year in which the German artist Albrecht Dürer produced this famous engraving of the fall of man. Since the technology that Dürer used meant that this could be handsomely reproduced again and again, it was successfully marketed and circulated throughout Europe. As a result, a very large number of people all over the place saw the same compelling image and felt that now they knew what the first humans in the Garden of Eden actually looked like. With Dürer, the unfallen Adam and Eve got their modern bodies, the bodies by which they became and still remain instantly identifiable. Dürer's engraving, I'd love to talk about it at length because I think it's an incredible image. I won't actually say very much about it now. I will just say that first of all, he was very aware that he was marketing it his. He signed it, put a little cartouche up here with his name. Albrecht Dürer made this in 1504, he says. This is probably the tree of life. This is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve is reaching here for the fruit, and Adam also has his hand out, though he's looking not at the fruit or at the serpent, but he's looking at his wife with her flowing hair. This is the moment just before it all changes. Everything is about to change forever. Our world is about to change, but this is as if someone with a camera with a very fast shutter caught the moment, just the moment of the not quite yet, just the last possible moment. One sign of the last possible moment, let's say, is this mountain goat up there that's about to leap off the rock but hasn't leapt yet. And a more interesting sign, I think, among the many things in this, is that you can see that Adam, you can't maybe quite see in this room, but Adam has his foot just very lightly on the tail of this mouse here. And there's a rather large pussycat that is looking in a kind of sleepy way toward the mouse. Well, we know that as soon as Adam takes that fruit, puts it in his mouth, the world will change, and that mouse will be toast. It's all going to happen. This was a tremendously famous image. We don't know what images of Adam and Eve John Milton, the poet, had seen before he went completely blind in 1652. But when he first describes the pair in Paradise Lost, his great poem, it's easy to detect the influence of Durer's engraving upon him. I'm going to skip over some of the details of the painting, of the engraving. Here's what you can see Milton's verses, and it's as if he's describing certain features that he remembered when he was still sighted from this image. I don't think it's a question of direct remembrance. It's rather that by the time Milton wrote Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve had, thanks to Dürer and thanks to other artists who followed in his wake, acquired bodies that looked like this. Hair that was a certain length, hair for the woman that was clustering in ringlets down, disheveled but in wanton ringlets waved as the vine curls her tendrils and so forth. Milton did not depict the first humans through a kind of mystical haze. He wanted us to see them naked and in all the vigor of robust youth. There was nothing dreamy about them. When they were hungry, they sat down on a soft bank by a stream and they ate the fruit that grew around them. And when they were thirsty, they scooped the brimming stream, he says, and drank. What Milton grasped, and this is the key thing that Milton brought to the whole story of Adam and Eve, was that an Adam and Eve who had real bodies, the way the Renaissance artists had given Adam and Eve real bodies, would also have to have a real relationship, an embodied relationship. And Milton felt that he was uniquely qualified to represent it, and indeed he did for the first time represent it. The narrative in Genesis was for Milton the way to unlock everything: anthropology, psychology, ethics, politics, and faith. And the story laid claim to him as well as he laid claim to the story. He brought everything in his whole being to it. And the result was that his Adam and Eve, the Adam and Eve of Paradise Lost, took on more intense life, the life of fully realized human beings, than they had ever possessed in the thousands of years since they were first conceived. But there was a problem, and that's at the center of my book. There was a problem when Adam and Eve finally get what St. Augustine hoped that they would get, which was to become real for everybody. The problem was not the unwillingness of the woman to submit to the man, because Milton didn't think the story was a story about Lilith, in effect. Rather, there was something Milton thought that was disruptive to marriage in the very experience of love, for the man at least as much as for the woman. This is tricky. Adam tries to explain the problem to the angel Raphael, who comes for a visit. I understand, Adam says in Milton. I understand, he tells the angel, I understand that my wife is the inferior one. I understand that we've both been made in the image of God. I resemble God more exactly than she does. I understand that I was created for God only, and she for God in me. But when I approach her loveliness, this account no longer seems true. So absolute she seems, and in herself complete, that if anything, it is she who seems the superior human being. This is a problem. The angel's response, which he contracts his brow and he tells Adam to have more self-esteem, is not helpful. Raphael warns Adam not to overvalue mere sexual pleasure, a pleasure, he says scornfully, that's vouchsafed to cattle. Adam replies with dignity that it's not only what happens in bed, though he regards that with greater reverence, he says, than the angel's remark suggests, that accounts for the feelings that he's been trying to describe. Rather, he says, it's those graceful acts, those thousand decencies, those words and actions that speak about a union of mind that so delight him in Eve. He's found his soulmate. He loves her. His love, the intimate physical and spiritual communion with his wife, cancels out the sense of hierarchy, the sense of superiority, to which he knows that as a proper male, he's meant to cling. Instead, he feels that bond in both of us, one soul. there is, in Adam's words to the angel, a polite but firm suggestion that the angel and his heavenly cohort have a very imperfect grasp of what it's like to be a human being. Indeed, Milton's first human famously allows himself to wonder, a fantastic moment in the poem, to wonder, given the angel's obtuseness, just what angelic sexual experience is like. I won't tell you, but it's, the angel tries to describe it. It's very funny. There's a kind of stubborn human independence in Adam, that in Milton, that would be completely shocking if one didn't remember that John Milton was expelled from Cambridge University by his enraged tutor, or that he was the man who refused to enter the path in the church that had been laid before him, or he was the man who rose up against the king and bishops and risked his life as a revolutionary, and a man who was determined to work out his own personal theology. The Adam who took living form in Milton's imagination was precisely not someone who would simply accept the doctrine that had been handed down from on high. But in this case, the superiority in principle of the male over the female, Milton didn't doubt that that must be true. The trouble was that the truth couldn't be reconciled with what it actually felt like in body and soul to love someone. The hierarchy, he for God only, she for God in him, begins to break down under the weight of the husband's recognition of his wife's beauty and kindness, and above all, her autonomy. So absolute she seems, and in herself complete. So the autonomy comes to the test the morning after the angel visits them, when the pair awakens to begin the day's tasks in the garden. The tasks are meant to be pleasant, Milton's poem says, but the work is real and not merely symbolic. And Eve says, you know, this work is getting out of hand. The garden keeps growing more and more and more. What they accomplish during the day is undone every night by the growth, and we have to wait for more people to help us. We'll eventually have other people around, we'll give birth to people, and they'll help us, but until then, we're only falling further and further behind. So she proposes an incredible idea in Milton. She comes up, she says, with a new notion, and it is what we would call division of labor. They should work in separate parts of the garden so they won't keep talking to each other and kissing and playing around the time that they should work. So Adam initially gives a mild answer, Milton says, and he prefaces it with the elaborate courtly address that he imagines that the first humans typically used. Soul Eve, associate soul, to me beyond compare, above all the living creatures dear, and so forth and so on. This is a great idea, he says. Wonderful that you've come up with this domestic notion, but it's misguided, he tells her, because, look, we're in paradise, and work is not meant to be drudgery. And then for a brief moment, he shifts ground. He says if perhaps what Eve is really saying is that she's been finding their conversation a bit tiresome, he would be willing to let her go briefly by herself. For solitude sometime, he says, is the best society. And then, not waiting for an answer, and not leaving well enough alone, he makes the terrible mistake of telling Eve that with Satan possibly lurking about, she should not in any case leave the faithful side that gave thee being. Now he's trying very hard to sound like the man that the angel wanted him to be. The wife, where danger or dishonor lurks, safest and seemliest by her husband stays, who guards her, or with the worst endures. Replying with sweet, austere composure, Eve, Milton says, begins with a courtly address, but she quickly turns to an expression of hurt feelings. That you should doubt my firmness, she tells Adam, I expected not to hear. I never thought you were going to say anything like that. Poor domestic Adam, as Milton calls him, tries to appease her, carefully avoiding the suggestion now that the wife is always safer by her husband's side. He renews the urging that they both together face any threat that might come at them from Satan. But the damage has already been done, and it's not undone. Eve still speaks with accent sweet, Milton writes, but this time she drops all polite formulas. If this be our condition, she begins, how are we happy? We must have been created with enough moral strength. Her word is integrity to enable us to resist temptation, whether in company or alone. Let's not imagine, she says, that the Creator made us imperfect, so that we had to cling to each other for defense. Frail is our happiness if this be so, she says, and Eden were no Eden, thus exposed. We know, of course, that all of this is heading for a real disaster, but it's difficult to refute Eve's argument, since we also know that Satan's threat is not a temporary one. Were they never going to part, even for a couple of hours? In that case, she might as well, as she quips, have remained a rib. After all, her confidence in her own integrity mirrors Adam's sense that she is in herself complete. Unhappy and exasperated, Adam finally bursts out, "Oh, woman!" As if called upon to defend the whole order of things, he says there's nothing imperfect in anything God created, but he himself has said he feels a little bit imperfect in relation to Eve. In any case, he's backed into a corner. God left free the will, he says, and in saying so, he has to permit Eve to leave his side. Go, for thy stay not free absents thee more. With thy permission, then, replies Eve, withdrawing her hand from his and going off on her own. Now, anyone who's ever had an argument with a domestic partner, which is to say anyone who's ever lived with someone for more than a few days, will recognize how brilliantly Milton captures the peculiar seesaw of love, anger, hurt feelings, attempts at appeasement, insincere compliments, passive aggression, frustration, submission, independence, and longing. And the genius of this invention is all the more remarkable, given the fact that Milton needs to persuade the reader that this squabbling husband and wife are in Eden. They're still unfallen. This is what a domestic quarrel in paradise sounds like. In paradise, or in Milton's Paradise Lost, the first humans have ceased to be mere ciphers. Milton couldn't stand the notion that they were simply tricked by Satan into disobeying, the victims of some weird celestial plot. Adam and Eve, he thought, must be intelligent and well-formed and forewarned. They must be free and they must be innocent. But if they're both free and innocent, then there must be something disturbing in innocence and threatening in freedom. What's disturbing in innocence, he thought, is the impossibility of understanding evil. No matter how many warnings you receive, no matter how much you try to imagine it or experience it in dreams, what's threatening in freedom is glimpsed in the pain of Adam's acknowledgement as he lets Eve go. Thy stay not free absents thee more. There are some things you can't compel, however desperately you may wish to do so. True intimacy being the foremost among them. And Eve's loving and perhaps slightly ironic attempt to assume the mantle of submission, with thy permission then, does not hide her persistent refusal or inability to give up her freedom. She might be persuaded, but she cannot and will not be compelled. It's this ineradicable freedom that threatens and in the event brings down innocence. But Milton thought that innocence without freedom was worthless, a state of perpetual childishness or bondage. Everything in his life, in his politics, his religious faith, his educational theories, his views of marriage and divorce, focused on consent, freely given or freely withheld. This sphere of personal freedom basically was the core of Milton's sense of any life worth living, any relationship worth having, and that's why it makes perfect sense in his poem for Eve to go off by herself for a few hours and to be alone when she faces the fateful temptation. Freedom belongs to each individual as an individual. So, okay, in the wake of what we know happens, their fateful choices, God chooses to inflict on them not an immediate death, but what Adam calls a slow-paced evil, a long day's dying to augment our pain. He decrees their expulsion from paradise in order to make sure that humans don't have the opportunity to reach out to the tree of life. Adam stands stunned with sorrow. Eve weeps at the prospect of leaving the flowers she's planted and the nuptial bower she's created. But the archangel Michael, who's been sent by God to enforce the decree, simply tells the woman and the man to vacate the premises. They're evicted by an implacable landlord. But by the close of Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve have become so intensely embodied, well, I'll come there in a second, in Milton's imagination, that they begin to crack open the whole theological apparatus that brought them into being. Milton and all of the, Michael and Raphael and Satan and even God have all begun to shrink. The theological apparatus is still in place, but the human beings take the center of the stage in Milton. Everything depends on the humans, and it's the humans leaving paradise that actually counts for Milton and for us, and entering a world in which they will still make choices of where to live and where to be and how to live. And that's the sign. Part of the lesson of my book is be careful that you might get what you really wish for. For 1,000 years or more, St. Augustine wished, and Christianity wished, that Adam and Eve would become real. And they did become real in the Renaissance, in paintings like Michelangelo's or Masaccio's or Durer's engraving, or in Milton's poem. But becoming real began to break the whole story open, began to make the story unbearable for at least a significant part of the population, which began slowly to withdraw faith in the story. Not entirely. Our world, including people here tonight, is a world in which people still care profoundly about the story, as I care profoundly about the story, but literal belief in the actual existence of Adam and Eve began to shrink precisely in the 17th century, has been shrinking ever since. The elements begin to seem less and less believable, and they're pushed, as it were, out of place by a different theory, by the theory that ultimately leads to that image which I flashed on the screen a second ago. That is to say, the vision that was brought into the world in the 19th century by Charles Darwin, who published in 1871 his Descent of Man. Darwin doesn't even mention Adam and Eve. Milton didn't wish this future. Yet, what most attested Milton's attention at the end of his great poem was not the huge cosmic theological vision of fall and redemption, but rather the quiet intimacy, the difficult intimacy of a married couple, of a pair who need each other, who quarrel and who reconcile. Though Adam has to run ahead in order to have time with her, he can't quite reply to Eve, but they say to each other beautiful words. With thee to go is to stay here. Without thee here to stay is to go hence unwilling. I want to be with you, one says to the other. Michael, the angel, seizes Adam and Eve in either hand, hurries them down through the gate onto the plain below, and then disappears. And what follows are among the most beautiful lines that Milton ever wrote. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way. The lines continue to express faith in Providence, but still more in the freedom that Milton believed that the first couple possessed, the freedom that still belongs to all of us humans. At the close of Paradise Lost, Milton liberates Adam and Eve from the story that gave them birth and watches them advance hand in hand toward an uncertain future. More than 1,000 years after St. Augustine, Adam and Eve had finally become real. Thank you very much for listening.
In Genesis, there are two descriptions of how man is created.
Yes.
One is in the image of God, and the other from the dust of the earth. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, of course. It's a famous conundrum. Chapter 1 of Genesis says that on the sixth day of the creation, God created man, male and female created he them, to take the translation of the King James Bible. Male and female created he them, and he urged them to be fruitful and multiply. No mention of any dust from the ground, and no separate creation of man and woman. And there is then a long, complex tradition of interpretation, one line of which is that it might have been a hermaphrodite created on that first day that was subsequently split, and so forth. I mean, there's serious lines of interpretation of what it means to say male and female created he them. But then in chapter 2 and 3, there's a different account of creation. So in the 19th century, starting in the 19th century, there are hints of it before, but very, very few. There was an increasing thought that there are two different accounts here, by probably from different sources. So Bible scholars call one the priestly text, P, and that's chapter 1, and chapters 2 and 3, J, of a Jehovahist source. It's mostly done by Germans in the 19th century, and then as German theologians and biblical scholars. But that view would absolutely have astonished and been unacceptable to most people before the 19th century, when it was thought finally that there must have been two different sources that were basically tied together. Before then, and after all, still for some people of faith, the Bible was dictated to Moses, called these the 5 books of Moses, and they must only have been a single account. So then they were obliged to figure out what is the relationship between chapter 1 and chapters 2 and 3. And as you can imagine with this, as with virtually everything else, this gigantic body of commentary trying to figure out, intellectuals are very good at this game, how you could possibly reconcile 1 and 2. Was 1 a summary of the events that were then opened up in 2? For example, or how to explain their various other ways of trying to explain it's easier to explain if you're reading the text allegorically or parabolically, but if you're reading it literally, it's actually very hard to do, because the garden doesn't seem to be created in chapter 1. And the idea in chapter 2, the man is created outside the garden out of dirt, and the woman is created inside the garden out of rib, and so forth. So what I can say about that in brief, I've given you a long answer, but in brief is that there's a huge body of commentary trying to grapple with this problem. Before the 19th century, if you raised this possibility that there were two separate sources, you might have been severely punished for the view, so it wasn't expressed very often.
After all your prior works, how did you decide on this for your next book?
Thank you for the question. First answer is simply that I love stories. I'm fascinated by narrative. And this is one of the greatest stories ever written, maybe the greatest story, at least in the Western tradition. Greatest in a complicated, multiple sense. I happen to like Middlemarch too, whatever, different kinds of stories, or Othello. But in an unbelievably short compass, a page and a half, nothing, everything seems to be accounted for. Sex, death, the need to labor, the women's pain in childbirth, the human fear of snakes, you name it. It's in the story somehow, compressed in this astonishing way. And the story is like a bone caught in the throat of the Western world. You can't swallow it down, you can't cough it up. It's a problem. It's continued for thousands of years, people struggling with it. So in a way, it's the ideal story to think about if you're interested in how stories achieve incredible power. So that's part of the answer. And I'm interested in the circulation of material, of stories of this kind. And the second part of the answer is that I wrote a book, as Andy mentioned in the introduction, about Lucretian materialism, Epicureanism, the belief that the world is just atoms and emptiness and nothing else. And that's a theory that goes back several thousand years, but was rejected. And for a very long time, until it came back, as it were, late last night. I was interested in why. Why the tremendous resistance? Why did it have to go underground? What is the other account that had such force, that it forced this, it compelled this ancient materialist account, which we now think is in at least closer to the way that the natural world is constructed. Why did it force it to disappear? And again, the Adam and Eve story is the quintessential representation of that thing that defeated the old story. So I'm looking at the, how should we say, the other side of the of what I described in the Swerve. So those are and besides, it's incredible fun, this material. It's just incredibly interesting. And maybe the third thing I will say is that, and I've already said it in my talk, one of the things that's so compelling about this material is that the people who made the difference in thinking about Adam and Eve, lots of people invested themselves in it, and that's the amazing thing about the story. We see a little quick sketch in the New Yorker, a little pen and ink drawing of a back of a naked man and woman. You know instantly what it is. You heard the story at 5 years old, you don't forget it. But the people who made a difference brought everything in their being to the table. St. Augustine, Durer, Milton, these people didn't hold anything back. They brought the whole being to the story, or alternatively, the story just took them and carried them forward. I find that also fantastically compelling.
So the tension, even in this country, between acquiring knowledge and an anti-intellectual strain. And so about the tree of knowledge, how did Milton work out, or can you talk about how Milton and people through the ages have worked out this issue of what we should know and not know?
That's a very good. Could you hear the question, by the way? Yeah. Okay. So there is a problem. First of all, a deep, deep problem in the story. One of the reasons that it's a bone caught in the throat is that for some people, at least interpreters, very, very early on, 2,000 years ago, they asked themselves, how is it possible that the first humans have a prohibition? They can do anything, they can eat anything they want. They're vegetarians, but they can eat any fruit that they want in the garden. It's all available to them except for one thing: they can't eat from that tree, unless they die. But people very, very early on said, first of all, how could they have known what he means by they die? Because there was no death in that world. How would you know what? It's very hard for a child to know what death is. How do you know what death is in a world with no death? And God doesn't bother to explain. So I sometimes picture Adam hearing God say that and thinking, I've got to ask him the next time I talk to him, what does he mean by dying? But anyway, that's a different matter. There's another problem in the story, which is that the thing that you're not allowed to eat is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And some people said very early on, the only way in which you could reliably observe a prohibition would be if you knew the difference between good and evil. So where do you go with that? And that generated a huge debate going back a very long time. So the earliest surviving trace of the story, which is from the Nag Hammadi codices dug up in the sands of Egypt, are texts that say that precisely because of the issue of knowledge, that the hero of the story must be Eve or the serpent and not God. God must be the villain of the story. That, of course, wanting to know, wanting knowledge is what you should want, what you should embrace as a human being. And therefore, Eve is a great hero because she is willing to take this risk and violate this terrible threat in order to achieve knowledge. So that's that line lost as an interpretation of the story. That's why it was buried under the sand 2,000 years ago. And so what's the alternative, to come to the heart of your question? And there are a variety of answers to the alternative. And the central one, let's say, for Milton, is that Adam and Eve actually were immensely knowledgeable. They knew a huge amount about everything, much more than we know. And that they lost that knowledge in the fall, and that far from dealing with innocence or naive people, we're dealing at the early, that God would have made them, it would have been intuitive knowledge, born in the way that the myth has, the same way language we have to learn language, but Adam and Eve evidently don't have to. They just immediately have it. And in the same way, they knew everything, in effect. And Milton had a theory of education, and the theory of education was that you studied, you went to school and university in order to get back closer to what Adam and Eve had in paradise. That far from being an anti-intellectual story, a story about discouraging you from learning, the story, rightly understood, was a story about trying to recover the knowledge that human beings had lost. And lots of people in the 17th century, including Francis Bacon, the creator of modern science, invoked paradise, Eden, precisely in that way, as the place of full knowledge. There were even theories, somewhat weird theories, that Adam wrote a book of philosophy, and so forth and so on, that they were immensely learned and knowledgeable.
So last year there was a really interesting exhibit at the Morgan Library celebrating the birthday of Martin Luther. And the work of Lucas Cranach figured very prominently in that exhibit. He painted something like 8, maybe more, paintings of Adam and Eve.
Absolutely.
And the interesting thing in your talking about Milton that came out of this exhibit for me was that somehow Adam and Eve, in this context of the Reformation, became our parents and the model for a good marriage. And seeing it in this Milton context sort of fills out that picture. But I think going forward, I wish you'd say something about how the Reformation dealt with this whole idea of marriage and the role of Adam and Eve.
Well, crucial, I mean, it's a rich question, and I could answer it we could talk about this at considerable length, but you're absolutely right that the Reformation made a huge difference in trying to understand what the relationship was. There's very little speculation about the relationship of Adam and Eve in medieval texts. Even in medieval representations on stage, there were these mystery plays, but in which the Adam says, "Who was that snake you was talking to, Mrs.?" in effect. I mean, but there's not much in the way of a subtle representation of an intimate relationship. But the Reformation turned a tremendous amount of attention to the nature of the marital bond. And in the case of Milton, the attention was heightened by the fact, I won't go into Milton's own very troubled marital history, but it was heightened by the fact that Milton championed no-fault divorce. Because Milton thought you couldn't talk seriously about intimate marriages unless you allowed divorce. Because you can't, because people screw up, because they make the wrong choices, and God can't possibly have wanted you to stay for a whole lifetime in a rotten marriage. That can't have been what. So he had to work hard because of, unfortunately, because of what Jesus said to the Pharisees, which sounds like Jesus was forbidding divorce. But again, intellectuals are good at this. So Milton worked out a way of understanding what Jesus said that had nothing to do with telling you not to get a divorce. And instead, Milton wrote the great divorce tracts of the 17th century. But he wrote those divorce tracts in order to defend the idea of marital intimacy. Because he thought if you can't have divorce, then you can't emphasize this, because most people have lousy marriages, at least starter marriages, and then work out the right choice later. That was Milton's account. All right, much more to say, but I'll have to stop.